The night of July 18th, 64 AD still burns in the annals of history, not just for the flames that devoured Rome, but for the emperor who famously fiddled while his city turned to ash. Or did he? Nero's name is synonymous with tyranny, excess, and madness. But what if everything we think we know about Rome's most notorious ruler is wrong? Behind the tales of golden palaces and brutal executions lies a far more complicated legacy, one that twists through 20 shocking chapters of power, art, and paranoia. Was Nero truly the monster history remembers, or a visionary trapped in his own myth? From his obsessive love of poetry to the whispered rumors of matricide, we're peeling back 2,000 years of scandal to reveal the man behind the infamy. Strap in, this isn't the story you were taught. By the end, you'll question whether any emperor's legacy has been more twisted or more misunderstood. The Great Fire of Rome wasn't just a disaster, it was the spark that would forever blacken Nero's name in history. For 6 terrifying days in 64 AD, flames tore through the heart of the empire, reducing entire neighborhoods to smoldering ruins. Ancient writers like Tacitus paint a chilling picture of Nero watching from a safe distance, strumming his lyre as if the screams of his people were mere background noise. But here's the twist: there's no solid proof he ever played music that night. In fact, some accounts suggest he rushed back to Rome from his seaside villa to coordinate firefighting efforts, even opening his own gardens to shelter the homeless. So why does the myth of the fiddling tyrant persist? Blame the rumors and the politics. Nero's enemies whispered that he ordered the fire to clear space for his lavish golden house. Others accused him of shifting blame onto a vulnerable group, Christians. Tacitus records that Nero punished them brutally, using their persecution to distract from public fury. Yet modern historians debate whether this was an act of calculated cruelty or desperate damage control. What's undeniable is that the fire magnified Nero's contradictions. The same man accused of singing over Rome's ashes also funded Reconstruction with stricter building codes and wider streets, reforms that lasted centuries. But in a city steeped in superstition, gestures like these couldn't outweigh the spectacle of an emperor more obsessed with artistic fame than governance. His next moves, extravagant performances, Greek theatrical tours, would only deepen the rift with Rome's elite. Because for Nero, the show wasn't just going on, it was becoming an obsession. Nero didn't just want to rule Rome, he wanted to own the stage. While most emperors used gladiator games and military triumphs to flaunt their power, Nero broke every aristocratic taboo by performing as an actor, singer, and even charioteer. Imagine the shock of Rome's elite when their emperor, dressed in flowing Greek robes, belting out tragic verses like a common entertainer. But Nero wasn't just indulging a hobby. His obsession with applause crossed into megalomania. He banned audiences from leaving early during his marathon recitals, and legend claims he once had deserters tracked down and executed. The irony: ancient sources describe his voice as weak and grating. Suetonius sniffs that Nero's singing sounded like a horse braying. Yet the emperor insisted on competing in prestigious Greek festivals, and unsurprisingly, he always won. Judges knew the price of defiance. After one rival dared to outperform him, Nero allegedly had the man poisoned. His delusions of artistic genius reveal a ruler who craved validation more than legitimacy. Meanwhile, Rome's treasury hemorrhaged gold to fund his spectacles. Lavish stages, imported props, and bribes to claqueurs professional applause makers emptied coffers already strained by the Great Fire's aftermath. But Nero's grandest performance was still to come. Because behind the scenes, he was crafting a stage of his own, one made of marble and gold. While Rome still smoldered from the fire, Nero seized the chance to build something unheard of, a pleasure palace so vast it sprawled across what would later become the Colosseum's grounds. The Domus Aurea, or Golden House, wasn't just a home, it was a statement. Gold leaf coated its ceilings, frescoes shimmered with crushed gemstones, and dining halls rotated on hidden mechanisms to mimic the motion of the heavens. One notorious feature, a banquet room where rose petals rained from the ceiling onto guests below. To Nero, this wasn't excess, it was art, but to the homeless masses it was an open insult. While families slept in makeshift camps, Nero's engineers diverted aqueducts to fill his private lakes. Farmers lost land to his manicured gardens, and temples were dismantled for marble. Even the statue at the palace's entrance, a 120-foot bronze colossus of Nero as the sun god, felt like a slap to a city still rebuilding. Small wonder later emperors tried to erase it. Vespasian drained Nero's lake to build the Colosseum, and Trajan buried the palace under layers of earth as if ashamed of its memory. The irony, that burial preserved it. Renaissance artists like Raphael crawled through its buried halls, marveling at the frescoes that would inspire entire art movements. Today, archaeologists still uncover hidden chambers beneath Rome's streets, each one a testament to the ruler who dreamed in gold while his people starved. And as Nero's palace rose, so did his paranoia, because no amount of splendor could silence the whispers of rebellion or the need to crush them. But Nero's hunger for control didn't stop at palaces and performances. His darkest legacy began with the one person who had fought hardest to put him on the throne, his own mother. Agrippina the Younger was no ordinary parent. A brilliant political operator, she schemed, bribed, and even seduced her way to securing Nero's succession. Yet their relationship was a tangled web of dependence and loathing. She famously called him her project, her masterpiece, but as Nero grew older, he resented being her puppet. The breaking point came in 59 AD, when Nero ordered her assassination in a plot so elaborate it bordered on theater. Tacitus describes how Nero invited Agrippina to a seaside villa, then sent her home on a sabotaged ship designed to collapse at sea. But Agrippina, ever the survivor, swam ashore. When news reached Nero that his mother had escaped, panic set in. He dispatched assassins to finish the job. According to legend, Agrippina's last words were chillingly defiant. She reportedly bared her womb to her killers and said, "Strike here, for this bore Nero." Historians still debate whether this was cold-blooded tyranny or a desperate bid to break free from her influence. Agrippina had been caught plotting with senators, and some argue Nero acted out of political necessity. But the brutality, and the fact he celebrated with a festival shortly after, hints at something darker. This wasn't just a power play, it was the unraveling of a man who saw threats everywhere, even in the woman who made him emperor. And once that line was crossed, the bloodshed wouldn't stop with her. Because if Nero could kill his own mother, who was next, the dinner party should have been uneventful, just another evening of aristocratic indulgence in Nero's Rome. But when Nero's stepbrother Britannicus raised his cup to toast, something went horribly wrong. The 14-year-old clutched his throat, his body convulsing before collapsing onto the marble floor. Within moments, the last direct heir of Emperor Claudius was dead. The guests sat frozen. Only Nero remained unnervingly calm, casually remarking that Britannicus had always suffered from seizures. No one dared contradict him. Britannicus hadn't just been Nero's younger stepbrother, he was a living threat. As Claudius' biological son, his claim to the throne was stronger than Nero's, whose power stemmed from his mother's marriage to the late emperor. For years, Agrippina had sidelined Britannicus, ensuring Nero's succession. But whispers persisted among Rome's old aristocracy. What if the true heir demanded his birthright? Nero's solution was swift and merciless. Historians note the poison's precision administered in public, sending a clear message to any dissenters. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was a meticulously planned eradication. The chilling contrast: Nero's later reign would spiral into impulsive violence, but Britannicus' murder was ice-cold strategy. Even the poison choice, reportedly a fast-acting variant to avoid prolonged suffering, hinted at a calculated pragmatism, yet the act backfired politically. While Nero tightened his grip, Rome's elite recoiled. Senators who tolerated his artistic indulgences drew the line at murdering a child of imperial blood. And Nero, emboldened by his stepbrother's death, began seeing enemies everywhere, especially among the aristocracy who whispered behind his back. What followed was a purge disguised as justice. Noblemen vanished under accusations of treason, their wealth funneled into Nero's coffers. Some were forced to suicide, others simply disappeared. The Senate, once compliant, grew restless. Because if Nero could kill a prince at dinner, who among them was truly safe? The seeds of rebellion had been sown, and ironically, the man who'd poisoned his stepbrother to secure power would soon find it slipping through his fingers like sand. Rome's elite had tolerated Nero's eccentricities, his poetry recitals, his Greek theatrics, even the Golden House's grotesque luxury. But by 65 AD, whispers of rebellion slithered through the Senate's marble halls. The Pisonian Conspiracy wasn't just a plot, it was a damning reflection of how far Nero's reign had spiraled into tyranny. Over 40 senators, knights, and even Nero's own inner circle allegedly joined the scheme, led by the aristocratic Gaius Calpurnius Piso. Their goal: assassinate the emperor during the games and restore Rome's dignity. Yet betrayal oozed through the conspiracy's cracks. A freedman's loose tongue tipped off Nero's spies, and what followed was a masterclass in state terror. The emperor's retribution wasn't merely swift, it was theatrical. Forced suicides became his signature punishment, a twisted mercy that let the condemned preserve their family's honor if they obeyed. When the poet Lucan slit his wrists, he reportedly recited verses as he bled out. The playwright Petronius, ever the provocateur, hosted a final banquet, gossiping Nero's secrets before opening his veins. But no death shook Rome like Seneca's. The Stoic philosopher had once been Nero's tutor, a voice of reason curbing the young emperor's excesses. Now, accused of complicity, he was ordered to die. Tacitus paints a haunting scene. Seneca's veins, already weakened by austerity, bled sluggishly. He drank hemlock like Socrates, but his body resisted. Hours passed as he dictated final thoughts to scribes, until at last, soldiers carried his limp form into a steam bath to suffocate. Nero's message was clear. No one, not even his old mentor, was beyond suspicion. Yet the purge backfired spectacularly. Each execution bred 10 new enemies, and Rome's aristocracy realized coexistence with Nero was impossible. The Senate, once cowed, began documenting his crimes, a damning record that would outlast him. Because terror, it turned out, couldn't stamp out truth, and as Nero's circle shrank to sycophants and yes-men, the empire's edges frayed. Revolt simmered in the provinces, and the legions, once loyal, started weighing their options. The Pisonian Conspiracy had failed, but it exposed a fissure in Nero's rule, one that would soon crack wide open. Nero's obsession with Greece wasn't just admiration, it was an identity crisis that reshaped the empire. In 67 AD, he abandoned Rome entirely for a year-long spectacle across Greece, competing in every major festival from Olympia to Delphi. To the shock of Roman traditionalists, he didn't just participate, he demanded victory. The Olympics were postponed a full year to accommodate his schedule, while judges, terrified of his wrath, awarded him first place in events he didn't even finish. One notorious incident: he fell from his chariot mid-race, yet still claimed the laurels. But Nero's Greek tour wasn't just about ego. It was a deliberate snub to Rome's military ethos. While emperors like Augustus had celebrated Roman conquest, Nero performed Greek tragedies in theaters, weeping onstage as if the fictional sorrows of mythical heroes mattered more than governing an empire. His grandest gesture, declaring Greece free from Roman taxes, was less about generosity and more about playing the enlightened monarch. The move emptied provincial coffers, forcing later emperors to revoke it. The irony: Greece itself was unimpressed. Locals mocked his mediocre performances, and some cities quietly reinstated taxes the moment he left. Back in Rome, the Senate seethed. Nero hadn't just neglected his duties, he'd replaced them with a fantasy of artistic glory. Worse, his religious provocations deepened the divide. He filled the imperial court with Greek priests, redesigned temples in Hellenistic style, and even proposed replacing Roman gods with Greek equivalents. To traditionalists, this wasn't just eccentric, it was sacrilege. The final insult: Nero returned to Rome through a breach in the city walls, a symbolic triumph for an emperor who'd conquered nothing but his own delusions. The message was clear: Greece had been his playground while Rome became an afterthought, and as disillusionment festered, the empire's foundations began to tremble. Because Nero's greatest miscalculation wasn't loving Greece too much, it was forgetting that Rome's loyalty had limits. Rome had tolerated emperors claiming divine favor before, but Nero took it to staggering new heights. While Augustus and Claudius allowed modest cults to form after their deaths, Nero demanded worship while still breathing. Statues of himself as Apollo or Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, sprang up across the empire, often placed beside gods in their own temples. In Ephesus, he rebuilt the city's great Artemis temple, then installed his own golden image inside it. Provincial officials learned quickly: honoring Nero as a god wasn't optional, it was policy. This wasn't just vanity, it was a political grenade. Traditional Romans saw emperors as first among mortals, not living deities. The Senate grumbled as priests were forced to include Nero's name in sacred oaths. But the real powder keg ignited in Judea, where Jewish rebels saw his statues as idolatry. When Nero replaced Jerusalem's high priest with his own puppet, riots flared, a preview of the cataclysmic revolt to come. Meanwhile, Christians, already suspect for refusing to swear by Roman gods, became prime targets. Nero didn't just want prayers, he demanded absolute spiritual submission. The fire of 64 AD handed him the perfect scapegoat. While Tacitus admits Christians were likely innocent of arson, their refusal to worship imperial images made them easy villains. Nero's persecution wasn't just punishment, it was spectacle. Victims were sewn into animal skins and torn apart by dogs, or impaled on stakes and set ablaze as human torches to light his gardens. These horrors served dual purposes: diverting blame from himself and reinforcing his godlike power over life and death. Yet the backlash reveals how badly he miscalculated. Even pagan Romans found the cruelty excessive. The same populace that cheered gladiators balked at burning civilians alive. Nero's divinity play didn't awe the masses. It exposed the fragility of a ruler who needed terror to command reverence. And as whispers spread that no true god would fear dissent, the emperor's golden statues began to look less like icons and more like targets. Nero's persecution of Christians wasn't just violence, it was theater. When the ashes of Rome's great fire still smoldered, the emperor needed a scapegoat, and this small, misunderstood sect became his perfect target. Tacitus, no friend to Christians himself, described their fate with chilling detail: covered in animal hides and torn apart by dogs, crucified in his gardens, or drenched in pitch and set ablaze as living torches to illuminate his parties. The horror wasn't just in the cruelty, it was in the spectacle. Nero turned suffering into entertainment, and Rome watched in uneasy silence. Some historians argue this was cold political calculation, with rumors swirling that Nero himself had ordered the fire. Shifting blame onto a marginalized group may have seemed like a survival tactic. Christians, already distrusted for refusing to worship Roman gods, were easy to villainize. But other accounts suggest Nero didn't just exploit their persecution, he relished it. The glee with which he designed their executions hints at something darker than pragmatism. This was a man who blurred the lines between justice and sadism, using his power to indulge his worst impulses. Yet even in a society accustomed to brutality, the public's reaction was mixed. While some Romans cheered the executions, others recoiled. Tacitus notes a growing sense of pity for victims whose only crime was their faith. The spectacle backfired, planting seeds of sympathy for a movement Nero had hoped to crush. Instead of cementing his authority, the persecutions exposed his desperation, a ruler so detached from his people that he mistook terror for control. And as Rome questioned his motives, Nero's private life spiraled into ever wilder excess. If the deaths of innocents troubled him, it didn't show. Nights dissolved into orgies where guests were reportedly forced to participate under threat of death. He staged mock weddings, marrying a freedman dressed as his bride, then allegedly castrated a young slave to preserve his voice for Nero's pleasure. The emperor who once played the artist now seemed to revel in his own corruption, as if daring the world to stop him. But every empire has its breaking point. While Nero partied, the provinces seethed, the Senate plotted, and the very streets that had trembled under his cruelty began to whisper a dangerous truth. No amount of fire, no number of scapegoats could burn away the reckoning to come. Nero's private life wasn't just scandalous, it was a deliberate dismantling of Rome's most sacred traditions. While emperors had flaunted mistresses before, Nero crossed every line, turning marriage into a grotesque performance. His first wife, Claudius' daughter Octavia, was exiled and executed so he could wed Poppaea Sabina, a woman rumored to have schemed her way into his bed. But even that wasn't enough. When Poppaea died, possibly from a violent kick to her pregnant belly during an argument, Nero's grief took a chilling turn. He found a freedman named Sporus who bore an eerie resemblance to her and had him castrated to serve as a bride in a public wedding ceremony. This wasn't mere decadence, it was political suicide. Roman morality prized dignity above all, and Nero's theatrics horrified even his supporters. Senators who'd tolerated his artistic indulgences recoiled at the sight of their emperor playing groom to a mutilated man. Worse, whispers spread that Nero had once tried to seduce his own mother, Agrippina, before her murder. Whether true or not, the rumor further cemented his image as a ruler unmoored from humanity's basic boundaries. Yet Nero's most damaging rebellion wasn't against morals, it was against money. Desperate to fund his excesses, he secretly debased Rome's silver denarius, reducing its precious metal content by 10%. To citizens, coins still looked the same, but their value evaporated overnight. Merchants caught on quickly, raising prices and fueling inflation. Nero had broken an unspoken imperial contract. Emperors could be cruel, but never thieves. The economy trembled, and for the first time, even the poor, long distracted by his lavish games, felt the sting of his recklessness. These weren't isolated scandals, they were symptoms of a deeper sickness. Nero no longer saw himself as Rome's servant, but as its untouchable master, a living god unbound by laws or decency. But empires aren't ruled by statues or wedding farces. They're held together by trust, and Nero was burning through his last scraps of it. With every broken taboo, he pushed Rome closer to a single, inevitable conclusion. Some lines once crossed can't be uncrossed. And the man who turned marriage into a joke was about to learn how seriously Rome took its survival. Nero's golden statues and lavish spectacles didn't come cheap, and when Rome's treasury began running dry, he turned to a deception that would cripple the economy for decades. The silver denarius, Rome's trusted currency for centuries, quietly became a shadow of itself. Under Nero's orders, mint workers mixed cheaper metals into the coins, diluting their silver content by nearly 10%. To the average citizen, the coins still gleamed in their palms, but their real value was evaporating. Merchants weren't fooled. Prices for grain, oil, and other essentials soared as trust in the currency crumbled. For the first time, even Rome's poorest citizens, once pacified by free bread and circuses, felt the sting of betrayal. Yet Nero's economic policy was a paradox. Even as he robbed Rome's pockets, he clung to populist gestures, doubling down on free grain distributions to the urban poor. Some historians argue this was cold calculation, a way to keep the masses just comfortable enough to mute their anger. Others see a ruler genuinely torn, desperate to be loved even as his greed undermined stability. Whatever his motives, the damage was irreversible. Inflation gnawed at wages, soldiers' pay bought less than ever, and traders across the empire began hoarding older, purer coins, a silent revolt against Nero's financial sleight of hand. The real catastrophe, though, wasn't just in the markets, it was in the military. Legionnaires stationed on Rome's frontiers noticed their pay couldn't cover basic supplies. Veterans returning home found their savings diminished, and as Nero siphoned funds to gild his palaces and stage Greek theatrical tours, border defenses withered. The provinces noticed. In Britain, Boudicca's revolt had already revealed the fragility of Roman control. Along the Rhine, Germanic tribes grew bolder, testing boundaries that Rome could no longer afford to garrison properly. Nero seemed oblivious. To him, coins were just tools, a means to fund his next spectacle or statue. But economics doesn't bend to imperial whims. By debasing the denarius, he hadn't just stolen from his people, he'd shattered the very trust that held the empire together. And as inflation eroded loyalty, the legions, Rome's ultimate enforcers, began asking a dangerous question. Why serve an emperor who valued his own glory more than their survival? While Nero obsessed over poetry and golden palaces, Rome's frontiers were unraveling. The legions, once the empire's iron backbone, found themselves underpaid, undersupplied, and utterly forgotten. Soldiers stationed along the Rhine or in Britannia watched as their wages bought less each year, thanks to Nero's debased coins. Worse, reinforcements never came. The emperor was too busy rehearsing for Greek tragedies or planning his next palace expansion to notice the simmering unrest, but neglect has consequences. And in the damp forests of Britain, a warrior queen was about to teach Nero a brutal lesson in what happens when you ignore the provinces. Boudicca's uprising wasn't just a rebellion, it was a wildfire of vengeance. After Roman officials seized her late husband's lands, flogged her, and assaulted her daughters, the Iceni queen rallied tens of thousands of Britons. Ancient sources describe her army burning Camulogenum to the ground, slaughtering Roman settlers without mercy. When news reached Nero, he reportedly hesitated, not out of strategy but distraction. By the time he acted, Londinium and Verulamium were already ash. The revolt was finally crushed, but at a staggering cost, 80,000 Roman deaths by some estimates. The bitter irony, Nero's own greed had fueled the flames. Roman tax collectors in Britain had been squeezing tribes dry to fund his excesses, while veterans' land grants went unpaid. Boudicca wasn't just fighting for revenge, she was capitalizing on widespread economic despair. And though Rome eventually restored order, the message was clear: the empire's edges were fraying. Meanwhile, another tinderbox was about to explode: Judea. Nero's heavy-handed appointments and temple plundering had pushed Jewish resentment to a boiling point. When his governor seized silver from the Jerusalem temple in 66 AD, full-scale revolt erupted. Unlike Britain, though, Nero couldn't blame this on provincial mismanagement. He'd personally installed the corrupt officials. Now, legions were bogged down in a grueling guerrilla war, their morale crumbling as they fought without adequate supplies or support. For soldiers on the front lines, the calculus was simple. Nero cared more about his lyre than their lives, and as desertion spread, so did a dangerous idea, one that would soon reach the highest ranks of the army. If an emperor abandons his duty to protect the empire, does the empire still need its emperor? Jerusalem's Second Temple wasn't just a religious site, it was a bank vault clad in marble, its inner chambers overflowing with centuries of donations from Jewish communities across the empire. And in 65 AD, Nero's hunger for gold turned his gaze toward it. Facing bankruptcy from his endless construction projects and Greek tours, he ordered his newly appointed governor, Gessius Florus, to seize 17 tons of silver from the temple treasury. The pretext, unpaid back taxes; the reality, a brazen theft that would ignite one of the bloodiest revolts in Roman history. For devout Jews, this wasn't merely robbery, it was sacrilege. The temple tax was considered sacred, each shekel collected to maintain the house of God. When Florus soldiers marched into the temple's inner courts, snatching silver under the guise of imperial authority, fury erupted. Protesters flooded Jerusalem's streets only to be met with brutal suppression. Florus, doubling down, ordered troops to raid the upper city's markets, crucifying hundreds, including Jewish nobles who'd once sided with Rome. The message was clear: resistance meant annihilation. Yet Nero's miscalculation went deeper than sacrilege. Judea had been a tinderbox for years, seething under corrupt Roman appointees and heavy-handed rule. The temple plunder wasn't the spark, it was the detonation. By 66 AD, full-scale rebellion erupted. Zealots overran Roman garrisons, and the elite 10th Legion, sent to quell the uprising, was ambushed and humiliated in the Judean hills. Suddenly, Nero faced a crisis he couldn't sing or bribe his way out of. Enter Vespasian, a grizzled general with no patience for pageantry. Nero dispatched him to crush the revolt, unaware he was handing power to the man who'd eventually topple him. Vespasian's campaign was methodical, but as he besieged Galilee, news of Nero's unraveling reached the front lines. The legions, weary of funding wars while their emperor strummed lyres, began whispering a dangerous truth. Maybe Rome needed a soldier on the throne, not a performer. The irony: Nero's temple theft had bankrolled his own demise. The very funds he stole to gild his palaces now paid the armies whose loyalty he'd squandered. And as Vespasian's legions marched closer to Jerusalem, another rebellion was brewing, one that would end not with Jewish independence, but with an empire trading a mad artist for a no-nonsense general. Because Nero forgot a fundamental rule: when you starve a province to feed your vanity, eventually the starving turn on you. 14th legacy: the false Nero's posthumous imposters and myths. Even in death, Nero refused to fade quietly from history. Within months of his reported suicide, rumors swirled that he'd escaped to the east, plotting his triumphant return. Over the next 2 decades, no fewer than 3 imposters rose up, each claiming to be the vanished emperor reborn. The first emerged in Greece just 2 years after Nero's death, rallying desperate supporters with promises of vengeance against the elites who'd betrayed him. The second, a shadowy figure in Asia Minor, nearly sparked a provincial revolt before Roman authorities captured and executed him. The most audacious appeared during Emperor Titus' reign, a musician who so perfectly mimicked Nero's voice and mannerisms that Parthian nobles reportedly offered him troops to reclaim Rome's throne. Why did his ghost haunt the empire so stubbornly? For the disenfranchised, Nero represented a perverse kind of folk hero, a ruler who'd lavished attention and coin on the plebs while thumbing his nose at the aristocracy. His staged populism left a void no pragmatic successor like Vespasian could fill, but the myth also served darker purposes. Anti-Roman rebels from Judea to Germania embraced the Nero Redivivus legend, casting the dead emperor as a prophesied scourge who'd return to topple the empire he once ruled. Even early Christians weaponized it, weaving Nero into apocalyptic lore as the Antichrist himself. The irony, the real Nero's final hours were anything but legendary. Abandoned by his guards and declared an enemy of the state, he allegedly whimpered, "What an artist dies in me," before botching his suicide. A loyal servant had to finish the job. The man who'd spent his life crafting a godlike image died as he'd ruled, caught between delusion and desperation, his legacy already twisting beyond his control. Because myths, unlike empires, don't need logic to endure. They just need someone reckless enough to keep them alive. Yet Nero's greatest illusion wasn't fooling the world into believing he'd return. It was convincing history he'd ever really left. Long after his bones turned to dust, the specter of Rome's most infamous emperor lingered, a cautionary tale about power's fragility and the stories we choose to believe. And as Rome's new rulers scrambled to dismantle his memory, they faced an uncomfortable truth. You can bury a tyrant, but you can't kill a legend. 15th legacy. Nero's cowardly flight and suicide. The Senate's declaration should have been the end, a straightforward fall from power. But for Nero, reality had always been optional. When word reached him in June of 68 AD that the Senate had declared him a public enemy, stripping his titles and sentencing him to a brutal execution, the man who once played God collapsed into hysteria. Abandoned by his guards, his golden palace now a gilded cage, Nero did what he'd always done best. He turned his downfall into a performance, fleeing Rome under cover of night with just 4 loyal servants. The emperor who'd once commanded legions now cowered in a freedman's suburban villa. According to Suetonius, he paced the room, lamenting his fate in grandiose bursts, alternately begging for poison to die like a gentleman, and sobbing that the world didn't deserve his genius. Even in disgrace, he couldn't stop auditioning for history's sympathy. When the thunder of approaching horses signaled the Senate's enforcers were near, reality finally pierced his delusions. There would be no encore. Nero's suicide was as chaotic as his reign. Too terrified to wield the dagger himself, he ordered a loyal slave to do it, then wavered at the last moment, whimpering about his wasted talent. The fatal stab came only after cavalry burst into the courtyard, half-hearted, messy, a far cry from the heroic deaths of Stoic senators he'd once forced to kill themselves. His last words, "What an artist dies in me," a final, theatrical flourish from a man who'd spent his life mistaking cruelty for creativity. But history loves an unresolved exit. Some accounts claim his loyal nurse secretly buried him in the Domus Aurea family tomb, while others whispered his body was stolen by mysterious admirers. Within months, the first false Nero emerged, sparking rebellions in his name. Even in death, he refused to be contained, a ghost haunting Rome's conscience, a tyrant reinvented as a tragic antihero. Because the darkest twist of Nero's legacy wasn't how he died, but how stubbornly the world kept resurrecting him. Yet beneath the melodrama lies an unsettling question. Was that dying cry about lost art genuine remorse, or just one last lie to himself? The emperor who'd burned Christians as torches, poisoned his stepbrother at dinner, and built a rotating dining hall while Rome starved, now begged for posterity's pity. Maybe the greatest performance of Nero's life wasn't the songs, the murders, or the golden statues. It was convincing even himself that he'd ever been the victim. And as his body cooled in that dusty villa, the Senate rushed to erase him. They chiseled his name from monuments, melted his coins, and cursed his memory. But some stains don't scrub clean, because Nero, in the end, had understood one terrible truth: infamy, like art, is eternal. 16th legacy. The Damnatio Memoriae erasure and resurrection. Rome's elite had suffered Nero's excesses for 14 long years, but with the tyrant dead, they weren't about to let his memory linger. The Senate wasted no time issuing a Damnatio Memoriae, the ultimate posthumous punishment. His name was chiseled off monuments, his golden statues melted down. Even the colossal effigy outside the Domus Aurea toppled and recast as the sun god Sol, a deliberate snub to Nero's delusions of divinity. Coins bearing his face were pulled from circulation, and official records scrubbed his reign like a stain. For Rome's rulers, this wasn't just justice, it was an exorcism. But erasing Nero proved harder than chiseling stone. In back alleys and taverns, whispers defied the Senate's decree. Some plebeians, nostalgic for his lavish games and grain handouts, left flowers at his unmarked grave. Others swore they heard his ghost singing in the ruins of the Golden House. Even the aristocracy couldn't resist gossiping about his scandals: the weddings, the murders, the fire. Nero had been vile, yes, but he'd never been boring. The irony, the very act of trying to obliterate his memory, only cemented his legend. By forbidding mention of him, the Senate turned Nero into Rome's first antihero, a cautionary tale too lurid to forget. Folk songs sprouted in the provinces, casting him as a tragic artist hounded by the powerful. Parthian kings, no friends of Rome, toasted his name. Even the Christians he'd burned found grim symbolism in his fate, weaving him into their apocalyptic visions as the beast of Revelation. History has a way of resurrecting what authority tries to bury. Nero's statues might have been smashed, but his story slithered through cracks in Rome's official narrative, mutating with each retelling. The Senate wanted him forgotten, but the people, in their way, kept him alive. Because whether as monster or martyr, Nero had become something far more enduring than an emperor, a myth. And myths don't fade, they adapt. Yet beneath the folklore lies a deeper truth. Nero's afterlife in popular imagination reveals less about the man himself than about Rome's anxieties, its fears of tyranny, its guilt over complicity, its fascination with the boundaries of power. The elite damned his memory, but the masses never quite let go. Because sometimes the stories we try hardest to erase are the ones we need most to remember. 17th legacy. Nero in Christian Apocrypha, the Antichrist myth long after Rome tried to erase Nero's name. A far stranger fate awaited him, rebirth as Christianity's ultimate villain. Medieval monks poring over ancient texts didn't just see a dead emperor, they saw prophecy fulfilled. The man who'd burned believers as human torches became, in their eyes, the blueprint for the Antichrist himself. Apocalyptic writings like the Book of Revelation dripped with coded references, the beast with 7 heads, the number 666, all thinly veiled allegories for Nero's reign. But how did a failed Roman ruler become the embodiment of evil for an entire faith? The answer lies in trauma. Early Christians, still reeling from Nero's brutal persecutions, wove their nightmares into scripture. The Sibylline Oracles, a collection of Jewish and Christian prophecies, foretold a monstrous figure who would return from the east, leading armies to desecrate Jerusalem. Sound familiar? Nero's rumored escape to Parthia after his death fit the template perfectly. By the Middle Ages, legends claimed he'd survived, hiding in shadows until the end times, when he'd rise again to torment the faithful. Yet this myth wasn't just fear-mongering. It served a theological purpose. Casting Nero as the Antichrist gave Christians a narrative framework, a way to explain suffering as part of a divine plan. If even Rome's worst tyrant was merely a pawn in God's ultimate battle between good and evil, then persecution had meaning. The irony: Nero, who'd sought godhood in life, achieved a twisted form of immortality in death, not as a deity but as the devil's right hand. Fast forward to modern portrayals, and the ghost of Nero still haunts pop culture. From lurid horror films to video games, his name conjures up megalomaniacal villains. But beneath the theatrics lies a profound question. Why does history keep resurrecting him? Maybe because Nero represents the ultimate cautionary tale, a reminder that power, when untethered from humanity, doesn't just corrupt. It mythologizes, and myths once unleashed are far harder to kill than emperors. What's striking isn't that Nero became the Antichrist, but that he still fits the role so neatly. In an age of cults of personality and performative cruelty, his legacy feels less like ancient history and more like a mirror. The medieval monks who branded him a demon might not have been wrong, just premature. Because tyranny, it turns out, is always waiting for its next act. 18th legacy. Nero in pop culture. From opera to film centuries after his death, Nero refuses to exit the stage. Artists, composers, and filmmakers keep dragging him back into the spotlight, not as a historical figure, but as a symbol. The ultimate tyrant, the mad genius, the cautionary tale wrapped in purple robes. Claudio Monteverdi's L'Incoronazine di Poppia, 1643, didn't just immortalize Nero in opera, it sanitized him, turning a murderer into a romantic lead crooning about love while ignoring the blood on his hands. That's the irony. Nero's legacy thrives not in accuracy but in exaggeration. Hollywood, of course, couldn't resist him. From Peter Ustinov's coy, grinning Nero in Quo Vadis 1951 to the more recent Roman Empire series, filmmakers amplify his decadence: golden palaces, orgies, and that infamous fiddle during Rome's burning, which, as we know, he probably never played. These portrayals say less about Nero and more about our obsession with rulers who blur the line between power and psychosis. His theatricality makes him the perfect villain, a preening despot whose crimes feel almost Shakespearean in their extravagance. But why does Nero haunt pop culture so persistently? Maybe because he embodies the darkest fantasies of unchecked authority, a ruler who treated laws as suggestions and humanity as a prop. He's a blank canvas for every era's anxieties. In the 17th century, Baroque composers framed him as a tragic lover. In modern dystopian tales, he's a blueprint for dictators. Each retelling twists him further from history and closer to myth. Yet for all his infamy, a surprising group has championed him, not artists but philosophers. Because buried beneath the chaos of Nero's reign lies a question that still unsettles us. Can madness and brilliance truly be separated? The answer might surprise you. 19th legacy. Nietzsche's bizarre admiration. The Übermensch emperor history remembers Nero as a monster, but one radical philosopher saw something else entirely. Friedrich Nietzsche, the 19th century thinker who famously declared God is dead, held up Nero as a shocking ideal, the Übermensch, or overman, a figure who transcends conventional morality to create his own rules. To Nietzsche, Nero wasn't just a tyrant, he was a tragic artist crushed by the weight of a mediocre world. In Twilight of the Idols, Nietzsche practically cheers Nero's defiance of Roman tradition, painting him as a free spirit whose only crime was refusing to bow to the hypocrisy of his era. This wasn't just philosophical provocation, it was a direct challenge to centuries of Christian-infused historiography. Where Tacitus and Suetonius saw cruelty, Nietzsche saw authenticity. The emperor's persecution of Christians, a rejection of slave morality. His obsession with Greek art, a noble pursuit of beauty over utility. Even Nero's alleged matricide became, in Nietzsche's twisted lens, a brutal act of self-liberation from his mother's scheming influence. But here's the catch: Nietzsche's Nero bears little resemblance to the historical record. Mainstream scholars point out that Nero wasn't some misunderstood genius. He was a spoiled, paranoid ruler who confused whims with vision. His artistic freedom came at the cost of thousands of lives. His rejection of morality, just a fancy excuse for unchecked sadism. The divide between Nietzsche's romanticized Nero and reality reveals more about the philosopher's own rebellion against 19th-century norms than it does about the emperor himself. Yet modern archaeology adds a new wrinkle to the debate. Recent digs at the Domus Aurea uncovered something unexpected: meticulous architectural innovations like concrete mixes that predated Roman mastery by decades. Nero's rotating dining hall wasn't just decadent, it showcased engineering brilliance. Even his infamous persecution of Christians lacks definitive physical evidence. Some historians argue the scale was exaggerated by later writers to vilify him. Does this mean Nietzsche was right? Hardly, but it does force us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Nero's legacy is a Rorschach test. To some, he's a warning about power's corruption. To others, a symbol of resistance against stifling traditions, and to a few lonely radicals, a dark muse who dared to live beyond good and evil. The real Nero lies somewhere in the chaos between these extremes, not a hero, not a demon, but a mirror reflecting our own fascinations with transgression and control. Because in the end, the most unsettling thing about Nero isn't how we condemn him, but how stubbornly we keep trying to explain him away. 20th legacy. New archaeological insights challenging the Black legend for centuries. Nero's story has been written in ashes, by ancient historians who loathed him, by Christian scribes who vilified him, by poets who turned his flaws into folklore. But what if the blackest chapters of his reign were shadows cast by bias rather than truth? Modern archaeologists are now peeling back those layers, and the discoveries might upend everything we thought we knew. Take the Great Fire of Rome. While Tacitus and Suetonius painted Nero as a callous spectator, excavations near the Esquiline Hill reveal something startling. Hastily built shelters, communal grain stores, and even remains of imperial-branded pottery, evidence of organized relief efforts. One dig uncovered a neighborhood rebuilt with wider streets and fire-resistant brick before the fire was fully extinguished, suggesting Nero didn't just watch, he mobilized. Could the infamous fiddler have actually been a frantic crisis manager, later slandered by elites who resented his populist policies? Then there's the Domus Aurea. Long dismissed as a monument to vanity, recent laser scans show its innovations were anything but frivolous. The palace's revolutionary concrete domes and hydraulic systems predated Pantheon-era engineering by decades. Even Nero's decadent rotating dining hall had a practical side. Its mechanism may have doubled as a celestial calendar, aligning with solstices. Was the Golden House a madman's playground or an experimental blueprint for Rome's architectural future? The most damning revision, though, comes from numismatics. Nero's debased coins are often cited as proof of his fiscal recklessness, but metallurgical analysis reveals a twist. While he reduced silver content, he standardized weights across the empire, curbing fraud by local mints. Some economists argue his reforms stabilized trade in the long run, even as they fueled short-term inflation. So where does this leave us? Was Nero truly worse than Caligula, who reportedly made his horse a senator, or Commodus, who reenacted Hercules' labors in the arena? Or was he simply the victim of bad press, a flawed ruler whose failures were amplified by historians with axes to grind? The answer likely lies somewhere in between. Nero's excesses were real, but so were his reforms. His paranoia bred violence, yet his populism won him die-hard fans among Rome's underclass. Perhaps his legend endures not because he was uniquely monstrous, but because he embodies our deepest fascinations and fears. The artist who mistook power for a canvas, the ruler who blurred the line between genius and madness. 2,000 years later, we're still sifting through his rubble, searching not just for the truth about Nero, but for what his story says about the nature of history itself. Because tyrants may fall, but myths are fireproof, lead into final wrap-up, and that whether as cautionary tale or misunderstood visionary is why Nero's ghost still whispers through the ruins of Rome. But before we close this chapter, let's ask one last question. Final thoughts. Nero's twisted mirror, monster or misunderstood? 14 years of chaos, cruelty, and contradictions. Nero's reign defies simple judgment. Was he a bloodthirsty tyrant or a visionary crushed by his own myth? The answer lies somewhere in the smoke between history's accusations and archaeology's whispers. Look at the wreckage he left behind: a senate purged of dissent, a city scarred by fire, a treasury drained for gold and vanity. Yet also wider streets that still shape modern Rome, engineering marvels ahead of their time, and a populist streak that made him beloved by the masses even as the elite plotted his downfall. Nero wasn't just a monster, he was a paradox, a man who sang of tragic heroes while becoming one himself. Absolute power doesn't just corrupt, it distorts. Nero's tragedy wasn't merely that he killed his mother or scapegoated Christians. It's that he had the talent to be great but the impulse to destroy. Every artistic ambition curdled into narcissism, every reform was overshadowed by brutality. His reign became history's ultimate cautionary tale. What happens when a ruler confuses adoration with divinity and whim with law? But here's the haunting twist. What if Nero had died at 23 like Alexander? Would we remember the promising young prince who championed the arts and curbed corruption? Would the Golden House be celebrated as a renaissance ahead of its time? History judges rulers by their endings, and Nero's was a crescendo of fire and failure. Yet in that failure, he achieved a perverse immortality. 2,000 years later, we're still dissecting his reign, still torn between revulsion and fascination. So what's your verdict? Was Nero Rome's worst emperor, or a product of a system that turned power into poison? Drop your thoughts below, and if this deep dive into history's most infamous ruler kept you hooked, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us for the next chapter of history's greatest enigmas. Because some legacies, no matter how twisted, refuse to fade.